In March of 2002, Pavel Novak was operating a backhoe on a construction site just outside of Prague when he hit something that made his blood run cold. The bucket had caught on something solid, and when he climbed down to investigate, he saw what looked like a human ribcage sticking out of the dirt. Now, finding old bones isn't unusual in Europe. Pavel had been doing construction for 15 years. He knew the drill. You stop work, call the authorities, wait for the archaeologists to come poke around for a few days. But when Pavel brushed the dirt away from those ribs, he saw something that made him immediately call the police instead of the archaeology department. Because sticking straight up through the center of that ribcage was an iron rod, thick as your thumb, driven clearly through the sternum and into the spine. And that's when Pavel realized he wasn't looking at some medieval burial. He was looking at what appeared to be a murder scene. Someone had been staked through the heart and buried in an unmarked grave. But here's where it gets really weird. When the police arrived and started carefully excavating around Pavel's discovery, they didn't find one body, they found 14. All of them staked, all of them with their skulls crushed, and all of them with sharp stones stuffed in their mouth. And when archaeologist Yaroslav Spacek arrived to examine what will become known as the Slakovets Vampire Cemetery, he made a discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about medieval European beliefs about the undead. Because these weren't random murders. They weren't even execution victims. These weren't even necessarily evil people who had been punished for their crimes. These were people who had been methodically, carefully, and deliberately transformed into vampires by their own families and communities. And the scariest part? The people who did this weren't superstitious peasants. They were following a sophisticated scientific protocol for dealing with what they genuinely believed was a supernatural epidemic. And honestly, when you understand what they were actually dealing with, their solution was pretty damn brilliant. Alright, let me paint you a picture of what Yaroslav Spacek found when he started systematically excavating that construction site. Because what Pavel's backhoe had uncovered wasn't just a burial ground. It was a catalog of medieval horror that read something out of a torture manual. Grave number 1. Adult male. Approximately 35 to 40 years old at death. Iron stake. 12 inches long. Driven through the 4th intercostal space. That's between the ribs, straight into the heart. The stake had been hammered in with such a force that it cracked the vertebrae on the other side. But that wasn't all. This man's skull had been split down in the middle with what appeared to be an axe. His jaw had been dislocated and wedged open, with sharp flintstones jammed between his teeth. But here's the part that really messed with Spacek's head. The bones showed clear signs of healing. This man had been injured, recovered, lived for months or years after those injuries healed, and then been brutally executed and buried like a monster. Grave number 2, young woman, maybe 25 years old. No stake this time. Instead, her head had been completely severed and placed between her legs, facing downward. Iron nails had been driven through her wrists and ankles, pinning her to the bottom of the grave. And wrapped around her neck was a chain made of what appeared to be blessed silver. Grave number 3 really got creative. Adult male around 40. His body had been buried face down, with his hands bound behind his back with iron wire. A large stone, we're talking about 40 pounds, had been placed directly on top of his back. But here's the kicker. His mouth had been sewn shut with silver thread, and then filled with garlic and what chemical analysis later revealed to be ground up blessed communion bread. And it just kept going. 14 graves, each one a masterclass in medieval anti-vampire technology. Stakes to the hearts, decapitations, dismemberments, holy objects, iron restraints, stone weights, like someone had been written a comprehensive menu for making sure dead people stayed dead. But here's what really freaked out Spacek and his team. The carbon dating showed that these burials took place over a span of nearly 200 years, from about 1350 to 1550. This wasn't just some isolated incident or mass panic. This was an ongoing, systematic practice that lasted for centuries. And the really disturbing part? Chemical analysis of the soil around the graves showed an elevated level of quicklime, a substance used to accelerate decomposition and neutralize disease. These weren't just symbolic vampire burials. These were people trying to eliminate some kind of genuine biological threat. So what the hell was going on in medieval Czech Republic that made entire communities so terrified of their own dead that they felt the need to torture corpses and pin them down like wild animals? To understand that, we need to step inside the shoes of a medieval Czech villager and experience firsthand what it was like when the dead started killing the living. Picture this, it's 1348. You're living in a small village about 30 kilometers outside of Prague. Your name is Václav. You're a blacksmith, and life is pretty good. You got a wife, 3 kids, a successful business. The harvest was decent this year, and you're looking forward to a relatively comfortable winter. Then in late October, your neighbor Thomas starts getting sick. At first, it looks like normal winter cold. Cough, fever, loss of appetite. But instead of getting better, he starts to get worse. He becomes pale and gaunt, he's coughing out blood, he can barely get out of bed. Now remember, this is 1348. You don't know about bacteria or viruses or contagious disease. You think illness is caused by bad air, evil spirits, or divine punishment for sin. When someone gets sick, you pray for them, maybe give them herbal remedies, and hope for the best. Thomas dies within 3 weeks. Horrible death, wasting away, struggling to breathe, coughing up more and more blood until the end. You help carry his body to the village cemetery. The priests perform the last rites. You bury him properly in consecrated ground and try to move on with your life. But then a week after the funeral, something impossible happens. Your wife Maria wakes up in the middle of the night, terrified. She swears she saw Thomas standing in your garden, looking directly at your house, pale, gaunt, wearing the same clothes he was buried in. You tell her it was a dream, but then the next morning, your neighbor Pavel mentions seeing someone who looked exactly like Thomas walking around the village square around midnight. Then your daughter says she saw him standing outside her bedroom window. Then the baker's wife claims he tried to get into her house. And here's where it gets terrifying. Because a few days later after these sightings start, Maria begins to show the exact same symptoms as Thomas had. The same pale complexion, the same wasting cough, the same bloody sputum. Then Pavel's son gets sick, then the baker's wife, then 2 more families, all with identical symptoms. All people who claim to have seen or encountered Thomas after his death. So what's the most rational explanation given the knowledge available to you in 1348? Thomas isn't properly dead. Something evil has taken over his corpse and is using it to spread sickness to the living. He's becoming what your grandmother warned you about, a vampire. The village elders calls a meeting. They consult with the oldest residents, the ones who remember the stories from their grandparents about dealing with supernatural threats. And they come with a unanimous conclusion. Thomas needs to be dug up and properly killed. What happens next is going to sound like something out of a horror movie. But remember, to medieval people, this was applied science. They were following established protocols for dealing with supernatural epidemic that threatened their entire community. 3 weeks after the burial, on a cold November night, the village men gather in the cemetery with shovels, stakes, axes, and holy water. Father Carol is there to perform necessary rituals. The blacksmith, that's you, remember, has forged special iron stakes blessed by the church. They dig by torchlight, working in shifts until they hit the wooden coffin. And when they pry open that lid, they find exactly what they expected to find, and exactly what was going to confirm their worst fears. Thomas's body looks wrong. His skin hasn't decomposed the way that it should have. His hair and nails appear to have grown. There's what looks like fresh blood around his mouth. And most disturbing of all, his eyes are wide open, staring directly up at them. To you and the other villagers, this is absolute proof that Thomas has become a vampire. His body isn't decomposing normally because it's being sustained by whatever evil force has possessed it. The blood around his mouth proves he's been feeding off on the living. The open eyes suggest he's somehow aware and malevolent. So you do what you have to do. You drive that blessed iron stake through his heart with 3 powerful hammer blows. You crush his skull with an axe to destroy whatever evil intelligence might be inhabiting it. You stuff his mouth with sharp stones and garlic to prevent him from biting or breathing on anyone else. And then, to make absolutely sure he stays dead this time, you bury him face down with heavy stones on top of the grave. If somehow the evil force tries to reanimate the corpse again, it will dig deeper into the earth instead of up toward the living. And you know what? It works. Within a few days, the mysterious sightings stop. The disease stops spreading to new victims. The community is safe again. Except, of course, none of what you experienced was actually supernatural. But understanding what was really happening requires knowledge that wouldn't be available for another 500 years. Alright, let's step outside of 1348 and back into the 21st century. Because what I'm about to tell you is going to completely reframe everything we just experienced. Medieval Czech vampire hunters wasn't dealing with supernatural monsters. They were dealing with tuberculosis, plague, and other infectious diseases that they couldn't understand or treat. Remember Thomas, our vampire? He died of what was almost certainly pulmonary tuberculosis, a bacterial infection that attacks the lungs and causes exactly the symptoms medieval people attributed to vampire attacks. The wasting away, the pale complexion, the bloody coughing, the difficulty breathing, especially at night. And tuberculosis spread through airborne droplets. When Thomas was coughing and struggling to breathe in his final weeks, he was literally spraying tuberculosis bacteria all over everyone who came near him. His family, his neighbors, people who visited him while he was dying. But here's the key detail that made medieval people think Thomas was causing new infections. Tuberculosis has an incubation period of anywhere from a few weeks to several months. People who were infected by living Thomas didn't start showing symptoms until after he was already dead and buried. As for all those sightings of dead Thomas walking around the village, we're talking about people living in extreme stress and fear, dealing with mysterious death and unexplained illness. Add in the fact that medieval villages were small, close-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's face intimately. In that environment, it's not hard to understand how a glimpse of a pale, gaunt stranger in the darkness, maybe a traveling merchant or a refugee from another plague-stricken area, could be mistaken for a dead neighbor. Especially if your mind is already primed to see supernatural threats. But what about horrifying exhumation scene? What about Thomas' unusually preserved corpse, the apparent hair and nail growth, the blood around his mouth? This is where medieval people's lack of understanding about decomposition created a perfect conditions for supernatural interpretation. Bodies buried in cold, oxygen-poor soil, especially bodies of people who died of certain diseases, can remain remarkably well preserved for weeks or even months. The hair and nail growth? That's actually skin shrinking as it dehydrates, making existing hair and nails appear longer. The blood around the mouth? Totally normal. As the body decomposes, blood pools in the lowest parts of the corpse due to gravity. If the body is lying on its back, that means the mouth and the nose. The open ice that so terrified our medieval vampire hunters? Ice are mostly water, and they're one of the first things to dry out after death. As they dehydrate, the eyelids shrink and can actually pull back, making it look like the corpse is staring at you. But here is the really fascinating part. People who died of tuberculosis or plague were often quickly buried to prevent further spread of disease. Quick burial in cold soil with minimal exposure to air creates ideal conditions for preservation. So the vampires medieval people were exhuming really were usually well preserved compared to normal corpses. And this brings us to the most mind-blowing aspect of this entire story. Medieval vampire hunting was actually incredibly sophisticated epidemic control, even though the people doing it had no understanding of basic bacteria or infectious disease transmission. Think about what the vampire hunting process actually accomplished. Communities identifies people whose death seems to be connected with ongoing disease outbreaks. They exhume and sterilize the corpse with quicklime. They remove and destroy clothing and burial goods that might harbor pathogens. They created community-wide rituals that reinforce hygiene practices and disease prevention. Most importantly, they created a powerful social mechanism for identifying and isolating potential disease sources. People who are exhibiting early symptoms of infectious diseases, especially if they were outsiders or travelers, were much more likely to be labeled as potential vampires and avoided by the community. Modern ophthalmologists studying medieval European disease outbreaks have found that communities with strong vampire hunting traditions actually had significantly better survival rates during plague and tuberculosis epidemics. Not because they were killing actual vampires, but because they were accidentally implementing effective public health measures. Of course, there were also horrific costs to this accidental medical success. People who were already dead were being brutally mutilated based on superstitious fears, and living people who showed signs of illness, especially foreigners and social outcasts, were being branded as potential supernatural threats. Which brings us back to those 14 vampire graves outside Prague, because when archaeologists analyzed the remains more closely, they found evidence that confirms this medical interpretation of vampire beliefs. When Yaroslav Specek and his team finished excavating the Slakovitz vampire cemetery and started running detailed analysis on the remains, they found evidence that completely supports the infectious disease theory of vampire beliefs. First, the demographics. Of the 14 bodies, 10 were adult males between the ages of 25 and 45. That's exactly the population most likely to be traveling merchants, craftsmen, or soldiers. People who would have had extensive contact with other communities and higher exposure to epidemic diseases. Second, isotope analysis of the bones showed that at least 8 of the 14 individuals weren't local to the Prague area. They had grown up in different regions, some as far away as Bavaria or Poland. These were outsiders who had died in Czech communities and been treated as supernatural threats. Third, and this is the smoking gun, pathological analysis of the bones showed a clear evidence of tuberculosis lesions in 6 of the skeletons. These people had definitely died of infectious disease that medieval communities would have associated with vampire activity. But what really sets the Prague vampire burials apart is how methodical and sophisticated they were. These weren't random acts of superstitious violence. They were following specific, detailed protocols that had clearly been refined over generations. The iron stakes weren't just randomly placed. They were positioned at precise angles designed to pin the heart and prevent any possibility of the corpse sitting up due to muscle contractions or gas buildup. The stone placement followed mathematical patterns that modern architects recognize as structurally optimal for preventing ground disturbance. Chemical analysis of the soil around each grave showed consistent use of quicklime, salt, and what appears to be blessed oil, a combination that will effectively sterilize organic matter and prevent bacterial growth. These medieval Czech communities had accidentally developed a pretty effective method for decontaminating disease sources. The tools used for vampire killing were custom forged for the purpose. Spacek found evidence of at least 3 different blacksmiths who had specialized in making vampire hunting equipment. Stakes with specific dimensions, axes with particularly blade angles, chains and restraints designed specifically for binding corpses. Data analysis showed that vampire burials typically took place between 2 and 6 weeks after initial burial. That's exactly the time frame when tuberculosis symptoms would start appearing in people who had been infected by the deceased person while they were still alive. Historical records from Prague archives show that vampire exhumations weren't spontaneous mob actions. They were formal community decisions that involved village elders, religious authorities, and trained specialists. There were established legal procedures for declaring someone a vampire and obtaining permission for exhumation and re-killing. But the Tlakovice cemetery wasn't an isolated case. Since 2002, archaeologists have found vampire burial sites throughout the Czech Republic. Prostojov in 2017, Brno in 2019, Kunahora in 2021. Always with the same methodical approach, always the same evidence of systematic epidemic control. What made Prague and the surrounding regions so sophisticated in their vampire hunting was the city's position as the center of learning and international trade. Prague was the seat of the Holy Roman Empire, home to one of Europe's first universities, and a crossroads for merchants and scholars from all across the continent. This meant Czech communities had access to information about epidemic patterns, burial practices, and supernatural countermeasures from all over Europe. They were essentially running a medieval version of CDC, collecting data on disease outbreaks and developing standardized responses. And unlike most medieval communities, Prague area villages actually kept detailed records of their vampire hunting activities. The Prague City archives contain dozens of documents describing vampire investigations, community decisions to exhume suspected vampires, and detailed accounts of re-killing procedures. Some of these records mention professional vampire hunters, traveling specialists who could be hired by communities dealing with suspected vampire outbreaks. These guys were basically medieval epidemiologists, even though they didn't understand the science behind what they were doing. Which brings us to the really fascinating question: what can medieval vampire hunting teach us about dealing with modern epidemic diseases? Here's where the story gets really interesting from a modern perspective. Because when epidemiologists started studying medieval vampire hunting practice in detail, they realized these communities had accidentally developed some incredible effective public health strategies. Medieval vampire hunters were essentially doing contact tracing and super spreader identification without understanding the scientific basis of why it worked. They identified people whose deaths seemed connected to ongoing disease transmission, and they developed systematic methods for eliminating those infection sources. Communities with strong vampire beliefs also developed sophisticated quarantine procedures. People who showed early signs of illness were closely monitored for signs of potential vampire transformation. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, their family and close contacts were often temporarily isolated from the broader community. And because vampire hunting involved formal community decision-making processes, it created a network for sharing information about disease outbreaks across different villages and regions. Traveling vampire hunters carried knowledge about epidemic patterns and effective countermeasures throughout medieval Europe. During the COVID-19 pandemic, researchers studying medieval epidemic responses found striking parallels between vampire hunting practices and modern public health measures. The same emphasis on contact tracing, the same focus on eliminating super spreader sources, and the same use of community rituals to reinforce protective behaviors. But maybe the most important lesson from medieval vampire hunting is the power of giving communities a sense of agency in the face of threats. Medieval people couldn't understand why diseases spread, but vampire hunting gave them a framework for taking action and protecting themselves. Modern conspiracy theories and alternative medicine often serve a similar psychological function. They give people a framework and actionable responses to threats they don't fully understand. The difference is that medieval vampire beliefs accidentally produce effective public health outcomes. Today, Prague has fully embraced its vampire hunting heritage as both a tourist attraction and a point of cultural pride. The city markets itself as the vampire capital of Europe, and thousands of tourists visit vampire burial sites and take vampire hunting tours. But beyond tourism, Prague has become a center of academic research into medieval epidemic control and the intersection of folklore and public health. The University of Prague now offers courses in medieval medical anthropology, and researchers from around the world come to study the Czech vampire burial sites. Archaeologists are still finding new vampire burial sites throughout the Czech Republic, and each discovery adds more evidence to our understanding of how medieval communities dealt with epidemic diseases. Ground-penetrating radar has identified at least 12 more potential vampire cemeteries that haven't been excavated yet. What I find fascinating about this whole story is how humans adapt. Faced with threats and their science couldn't explain, medieval communities developed sophisticated response systems that actually worked. They weren't ignorant, superstitious peasants. They were intelligent people using the best information available to them to protect their communities. The fact that their explanation were supernatural doesn't diminish the effectiveness of their solutions. Plus, let's be honest, driving a stake through the heart of a suspected vampire is a lot more dramatic than wearing a face mask. Medieval people knew how to make epidemic control look badass. Thanks for joining me on this journey through Prague's vampire burials. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.